What if you left the military disillusioned and upset about where you saw the direction it was headed? Losing sight of the purpose that you had dedicated your life to and finding yourself contemplating suicide. Searching once again for the answers and finding yourself drawn into multiple projects that led to possibilities you had never dreamed of in the past. Using skills that you were taught as a Green Beret to make that human connection to amplify the message and effectiveness of the mission you are now on. Join me as I talk with Scott Mann about his journey in commissioning as a Special Forces officer, facing a rocky military transition period, becoming a playwright, publishing multiple books, and coaching others to be better leaders within their own space and community. This is Veteran Success Story. Welcome to another episode of Veteran Success Story. In this next episode, I don't really think I need to go too much into the introduction because I don't know many people in this space that don't know who Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann is. Well, retired now, of course, but man, somebody who's really just had an impact out there between the multiple projects that he's had. But, you know, actor, author, playwright, storyteller, coach, leadership academy. I mean, you want to go into all of it. Scott is, you want to figure out really the title of his new book. I know I have the old one here behind me, Operation Pineapple Express, but his new book, No One Is Coming to Save You, A Green Beret's Guide to Getting Big Shit Done. Good book. You know, I met him earlier in the year, or last year, in Florida, and we had a little bit of a discussion, but since then I read the book and left enough of an impact where I reached out to Scott and I was like, hey, why don't you come on the show? Let's just talk. I know he's done a lot of stuff out there. He's much like myself in the way of the amount of content that he put out there for this book, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. But I didn't want to focus on the book, and I didn't want to focus too much on his journey. I actually wanted to talk more to Scott about the fact of human connection. It's something that keeps coming up in conversations that I've been having with some of the guys, and it fit perfectly in with another episode that I had already recorded that's coming down the road. So I actually think that one's up next. But in this one, myself and Lieutenant Colonel Mann talk about just that, about that human connection and how it's needed and how that can be valuable between one another and how we need more of that out there. So let's get into the episode, and thank you for listening. Follow and subscribe for more. I know there's 97% of the people out there that are listening to this show. I'm not kidding about that number. I can see the metrics. It shows that 97% of the people that tune in don't subscribe. They don't follow. They keep coming back though. So if you listen to it, just hit follow or subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it actually helps me out on that way. I really appreciate it. And what I'll do in return is I will put that much more effort into the show, because as this thing grows, it makes it available for me to kind of get some sponsors behind the show, but I'm going to do it in such a way to where it's not breaking up our content. I didn't enjoy that when I was listening, so I won't do it to you either. But if you could, follow, subscribe for more, and I hope you enjoyed this next episode of another Veteran Success Story. Welcome to another Veteran Success Story. Today, I'm joined with Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, retired, also author of Pineapple Express, his newest book, Nobody's Coming to Save You, The Green Beret's Guide to Getting Big Shit Done. And I mean, geez, in doing my research and everything, you have a lot of irons in you've done a lot of stuff along the way up until where you are now, but I see like this trajectory of it's just things taking off, but you just keep, all right, let's do this. And it's so impressive to see, you know, all right, not an author, I'll figure it out. I'll figure out how to get this story across. Not a playwright, not a problem. All right, let's delve into it. I mean, it is the quintessential Special Forces, Special Operations. I mean, that is how many times we've been handed something and then figure it out.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate you having me on. I'm really glad we were able to circle back after we met in Orlando. And I would submit that that's not universal or not unique to SF guys or special operators. I mean, I've worked certainly. In fact, I spoke to a whole room of paratroopers at y'all's your gathering, your annual gathering, and in my short 23-year career, I worked a lot with just combat infantrymen, paratroopers, hell, truck drivers, that were making that treacherous route around Ring Road. And what always just um man, particularly in the global war on terror, what really just amazed me was the ability of our guys and girls to just get handed this shit sandwich and just say, okay, I'll figure it out. And they did. I think it's probably one of the most unspoken stories or untold stories of the 20-year war is just how many times from the bottom up guys and girls were thrown this just really, really, thorny, wicked problem, and they found a way to get it done. And I certainly don't consider myself anything special in that regard, but I do know that that's where I learned it. I know that that's where I saw it modeled. And I am absolutely 100% convinced, Will, that that stayed with me after I came home. And it has inspired me to this day, all these years later, that's still kind of how I think about the world. And for me, it's not about, it really isn't. Like, I don't even know where I'm going right now. I just know that when I'm having impact and I feel relevant, that's when I am most whole. That's when the snakes in my head are not as active and I actually feel like I'm moving in the right direction that I'm meant to move. So most of the time, I'm just way out over my skis, trying to figure out the next move.
You and me both, man. Oh my gosh. If that would be the description of life right now, for
Right?
sure. But there is those signs and stuff that you kind of like you just said it right there when you feel like you're headed in the right direction. Sometimes you don't know what that next step is going to be, but you kind of feel it out and you point your azimuth and you're like, all right, let's go. Sometimes you need a course correction, but that's it 100%.
I've been working around since I got out. I've been out like 12 years, and a lot of work in just kind of leadership, but more in the art and science of human connection. And I've always been fascinated by leaders that we want to follow, that we feel compelled to move with. And a couple of things I've landed on, one of my own maybe epiphanies is that I found that typically the people that we tend to move with, the leaders that we feel safest with, are the ones who are relatable to our pain and who are relevant to our goals. And so I've kind of just adopted those as metrics in my life. I try not to let the other just transactions and booby prizes pull me off. It's like, am I relatable? Am I relevant? Am I relatable? Am I relevant? And then another one that I'll just throw out here, my buddy Tim Spiker, in his book, The Only Leaders Worth Following, he's done a lot of research on this, and he says that the only leaders worth following are inwardly sound and others focused. And I don't know. So those kinds of metrics, as I, hit the ripe young age of 56, like, they really land with me. They just make me feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, you know.
What you're saying with focused on others there, that was one of my old commanders, one of the speeches and stuff that he gave out to the men really stuck with me. And that was the era of responsibility in having to do it, like recognizing what leadership should look like. And it had to do with, is everything pointed up at that leader, or are they enabling everybody underneath them? And I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there.
I agree with you. I mean, just when you and I were talking off camera, like the things that you're doing with your platform to just, be there for your guys and your buddies. I think I'm really encouraged by that. I see it because of the play. We travel around a lot, and
Yeah.
I do a lot of talkbacks with just veterans and their families and civilians around the country. And I spend a lot of time talking to veterans where they are. And I'm really encouraged I'm somewhat discouraged by the top down leadership, uh, but I'm overly encouraged by what our generation of warfighters are doing for each other. And I have a lot of hope for that, man.
I do think that there is something special about this generation in there. I know, and not to detract from anything like World War II, Greatest Generation and whatnot, but people look at that and they don't think to themselves, though, like, you have that same foundation, these principles and stuff that were built into us, and the disciplines that we learned in the military. It's kind of that same foundation that we have there, and we have that potential. So it's like, get out there and one
Yeah,
word in front of the other.
great point. And that's something too that, like, I always try to lead with when I talk about Task Force Pineapple as a nonprofit is I try to say is, look, what our veteran population and their families, frankly, represent in this country today, and whether that's global war on terror, Vietnam veterans, Korean War, um, I personally think, and I'm not just saying this, I mean, I really feel comfortable saying this, that our veteran population and their families are a level of human capital that probably represents the last best hope of this country.
Yeah.
I really do. I think that we have, for whatever reason, we have socially evolved to a point in our society that there are very few pockets of folks that you look at and you go, that's what right looks like. And granted, man, we are scuffed up as hell and we've got stuff to move through, but I really do believe that particularly the global war on terror generation, their work's not done. The war may be, the 20-year war may be over, but I really do believe if there is a pathway into better days in this country, it's our GWAT men and women that are going to shine a light on it. And I just think what an amazing thing for these humans to do after what we asked of them for 20 years, that they're still, it's kind of like the Vietnam generation. You remember how they showed up for us in the war? I can't tell you how many Vietnam veterans were at my shoulder throughout the war, quietly at the airport, calling in to check in on me. And then when Kabul fell, I don't even know how many called me. And I don't know. I just think that there's a role like that for us to play. I don't know quite what it is, but I think it's already starting to happen.
You see it in the communities and stuff too. You see it in the ones that kind of, they step up. Something even as simple as coaching the kids, sports leagues and stuff like that. That leadership end of things, people flock to it. It's like a light. And when you have somebody that has a strong foundation, and they'll listen to other people too. It's not like hey, I'm a stonewall, but they're listening on that end and actively giving that advice. But they're set on that path, and it's that at least some of us anyway. I like to think is that they're doing that hard right over the easy wrong.
I think so. I do. And again, we've all got our challenges with that, and I think that's kind of where when I think about like veteran advocacy and where we are today on the other side of the 20-year war, I think, man, more than ever do we need the GWAT generation back in the game here at home. Like, we need them leading us here at home. But there are things that we've got to, as a civil society, we've got to deal with that are going to, I think, that are kind of impeding that population getting back into the game to the degree that they could and leading us here at home. I mean, just one example is, just the moral injury, that occurred after the collapse in Afghanistan. And I know there's disagreement on how the war ended and whether we should have evacuated or not evacuated, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking
beyond that point at this year,
way beyond that, is that there was a level of harm done to a lot of people along moral lines that are still having massive impacts on very, very high performing people. And, one of the things that most experts on moral injury, if there are any, will agree on is that leadership is essential for moving from moral injury to moral recovery. In other words, that injury of the soul where, one went against one's code or was pushed to go against one code or one's leader violated that code. You got to have leader involvement in how you move away from that. And I don't see that right now. And I think that that's a big deal. Otherwise, that simmering wound is going to fester like it did with our Vietnam brothers and sisters. And that's not cool, man. I'm not good with that.
I hear you on that one. That's Well, let's talk about on that involvement, on how you personally became involved in there. I know, like, with what you're talking about here, the biggest thing that I see right now is egos, and we've all seen it on the battlefield and stuff too, is those times and where people ended up in a bad situation, or people ended up getting killed. And a lot of times, it's not always someone's fault and whatnot, but a lot of times there's a lot of things to where it's like, if that ego was in check, if that wasn't there, or that person didn't make that decision based on ego, it would have been a different outcome,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think I'm a little concerned in what's happening in the GWAT veteran community today as I look across the landscape. I mean, kind of feel like we're tearing each other apart in a lot of ways. I don't, it makes me very uncomfortable to see that. I don't like it. I think that at the same time, I feel like our veterans and their families have a role to play in public facing, whether that's podcasting, whether that's public office, whether that's, leading a corporation, or whether it's just leading your PTA. I think that veterans, being, this whole quiet professional thing, sometimes I think can be almost like a shadow problem. It can actually conspire to have us pull back and not step into the light and lead in a meaningful, responsible way. But you're right. I mean, the ego. My dad was a wildland firefighter for almost 43 years, and he fought these big fires like you see out in California, and he led one of the top two like fire teams in the country. There were two. They're called regional command teams, and he had a motto on that team, and everybody even had it on their bags and their gear, which was "Don't strut." And, my dad was very big on that for my brother and me growing up too. He's like, man, if I catch you strutting on the field or on the court, like I will literally come and pull you off myself. And so, I don't know about you, Will, but I was always surrounded by so many good quality people. Like the thought of even kind of like bragging on what I did was terrifying, because like I was so substandard to the dudes that I served with. And frankly, they saw a ton more action in combat than I did. I mostly found myself working in operation centers because I was a field grade officer. I did, some things, but certainly nothing, heroic or valorous. But I don't know. I kind of look at that like when you come home and in the storytelling mode, like that's not a necessary component of storytelling. It's not a necessary component of influence or relevance is valor. If you demonstrated valor, great, if that was part of the story. But if it didn't, then you don't need to make it so. Like, it just tell the story. Like, because it's really about your personal experience with the struggle and taking off the body armor and letting the ego aside and talking about the actual, journey through it.
Yeah.
Hero's journey framework in storytelling does not mean you're a hero. That word simply means protagonist. And so I don't know. I think you're right. And it is maybe our own civil society and the social media and the way it's so pervasive. Maybe there's just a compelling urge to do that, but it is a problem. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, there's two things there. For one of them, the silent professional, we're living in the world of information, and it's case in point right here, this podcast, the ability to open up and reach X amount of people. This thing is small in the beginning, and it'd blow your mind if you saw the metrics. People, and I'm sure you've seen it on yours too, to where it's like people don't subscribe to the podcast, but they keep coming back, which is weird.
Not at all. It's not at all weird. No, I could tell. Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense, and I think it's hard for you to probably realize it, like me too, because you're like, well, I don't know why anybody would keep listening to this, but because it's just me. But it is a cool thing to see. Yeah, please.
It is. But you have the potential for people going out there, and we've all had the guy who embellishes and stuff.
Yeah,
and it's not even honestly. And I've seen it with some of the stuff. I went through a little bit of this stuff in writing the book, my own book on that end. Yeah. And it was the fact on where Sometimes people will remember things differently. Sometimes they do blow it up in their head. I tried to be very careful about that and be like, hey, we're not embellishing anything. We did do a great thing. And in some of the stories there, I decided to tone it down more because I was like, look, it was crazy, but that's not really what's important on what's happening here. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think really what it is accountability. There's been a lot of lack of accountability out there. And then when someone does stand up and they're like, all right, hey, whoa, here's the facts. And then all of a sudden it just becomes this big pissing match. And I don't understand completely the reason for it, other than, all right, maybe I screwed up, you lose face that way. But at the same time, who knows?
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know either, and I agree with you. I mean, when we tell stories, there's always, particularly when they're around intense moments, right? So the details get skewed, and storytelling always has some form of embellishment because it's the point of view of the teller, right? So there's always going to be an inflated or deflated perspective. That's the flawed aspect of storytelling.
Yep.
But there's always, but the through line is always truth, right? You always want truth to be the through line on the storytelling. And the other thing, and this is where I think a lot of people miss it, in where, just years of studying storytelling since I got out of the military with neuroscientists, performers, even indigenous storytellers. Storytelling is done in the service of the listener, not the teller.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that is most often flipped in an unhelpful way, is that someone tells the story for their own benefit, right? And it's not in the service of the audience. But if you look at the biological relevance and purpose of storytelling over the last 70,000 years, it was for me to stagger into the campfire 10,000 years ago and say, all right, let me tell you all why saber-toothed tigers make shitty pets, right? And everyone around the campfire is like, they're in a trance state and they're listening autobiographically, right? And so when I talk about the way the saber-toothed tiger, tore me up and how it broke my heart, I thought it was my pet. Like, and here's what I learned and here's how I changed. People are literally feeling that, like in their chest cavity. And now they've now learned at an accelerated rate through my lived experience as if it were their own at a sensorial level. And that is, at the most fundamental aspect of storytelling, like that's what it is. And I think what's happened in today's society is we've stopped telling stories in the service of the audience, and they're serving ourselves. And I think that's a major mistake, and it will invariably end up with a grenade rolling back in the room with you,
You're not wrong there at all. So let's, I know you've probably told this story a few times and whatnot, but I know one of the things that hit me in reading through the book was talking about your own experience within the VSOs and stuff. I know that we had a little bit of kind of that same, hey, we're out there, we're living with the Afghans. We're not doing the, in and out hits kind of thing. We were right there living with the ANP, 30-man element. But it sounds like a lot of the same thing that you guys did there with the VSOs. And I know they were stood down a little bit later on, which was a shame just because I could see the writing on how Afghan people operate. There's this huge human aspect there to where they really haven't been, I feel anyway, their society hasn't just been taken over by technology in that way. And they really value that human connection, and those connections there are lasting. And it's almost a model of, it really is like a model of how we should be in that way.
Really, I mean, that whole, what you just said is a whole podcast. I mean, that's really good. I would say with the village stability operations, that was the formal title of it. And to be super candid, I agree with you. I think it was probably, and there have been other pretty senior folks that have said it was probably the only strategy or approach that ever had a chance of working in Afghanistan. And it was in fact working. I mean, we went from 6 villages in 2009 to 113 villages by 2012. Now, these villages, as you know, were in very contentious areas. I mean, some of the most contentious areas of Afghanistan. And what this program was designed to do, for those of you that don't know, is like, think of kind of a modern day Magnificent Seven, whether you want that to be, was it Yul Brynner or Denzel Washington? There's two different makes of it. But the storyline's the same. Is a handful of cowboys go into a Mexican village, and they help the village stand up against local banditos, bad actors that have infiltrated the village and are basically, taking advantage of the village. And so that was the approach at a most basic level of village stability operations. But here's the thing, and this is the story that a lot of people don't hear, is that program did not start until 2009. Now, when we went into Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, Green Berets were one of the first groups in, and they're chartered to do the by, with, and through thing, Will. They work from the bottom up, kind of that Lawrence of Arabia work. And so it was not a stretch at all for them to go in like they did, work with the Northern Alliance, some of the Pashtun tribes in the South. And within about 90 days, by early 2002, you had really pressed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of the country, and you had re-empowered a lot of these indigenous societies. Now, what's not talked about, and it really needs to be, is a lot of these tribes that were empowered. It's kind of a lazy term. They were warlords, and these were bad actors who had abused and raped the Afghan people throughout the Civil War. Were now re-empowered by us in the North and other places. Now they were made ministry officials, in the government, and so what. Your point about the way of life in Afghan rural society, 90%, 95% of the Afghan population is off the beaten path, and they live in what's called a status society, which is bottom up, honor, shame, feud, old school stuff that we all hail from. And that's still the case. Only a small percentage of the country is top down, kind of autocratic, governmental kind of stuff, rule of law, and that's Kabul, Kandahar, and not far beyond that. So there's always been conflict and tension. We should have known that early on in the war, but we didn't. When we went in bottom up like we did, we quickly switched over to a Vietnam-style counterinsurgency model where you had 100 and some odd thousand troops all over the country, and it didn't work, right? And so I'm not telling you all that, Will, as the guy that knew all this. In fact, I was participatory in the first two deployments of the top-down surgical strike targeting kind of stuff, even though as a Green Beret, I really surrendered. And I told the 82nd guys this at the convention. I said this. I said, personally, I was not as vocal and adamant about the bottom up, by, with, through with the villager stuff as I should have been in those first two deployments. And I think that my actions and others contributed to this. By 2009, we looked around and there were more Taliban in the rural areas than when we started. Right. And so where I'm going with all of this was, it took us all the way up until 2009. And for me, it was personal. Like, my Ranger buddy, Cliff Patterson, was killed in the Pentagon on 9/11. All I thought about for the first two deployments was payback. Yep. And then, of course, you lose friends in combat, and what happens? It just spins. I was a victim of feud mentality myself. And so by 2009, though, we looked around and we said, we need a new approach. Well, the new approach isn't new at all. It's what the Green Berets did with the CIDG program in the Montagnards in Vietnam. It's what we've done in Guatemala, Philippines. But we finally got back to what's called remote area foreign internal defense, or getting out into the hinterlands and letting Green Berets work with villages and walk them back to the government. That's all VSO is. It worked great for 2 years. And then in 2012, after we made all these promises to the Afghans about we were going to stay, we bailed. And I had personally just been assigned a battalion command as a lieutenant colonel. And it was a real blow to me. In fact, most of the elders I recruited were killed as a result of retribution. And I turned down 3 consecutive commands and I retired. Like, because for me, by 2013, I saw where this was heading. And I was like, I can't do this. And that actually was a big impetus for my mental health spiral, the play I wrote, everything. It shaped everything on how I viewed through that lens. And I know that was a really long answer, but for VSO, that was my personal experience with it. And the last thing I'll say on it was, I did have the opportunity with VSO to be an architect, to be one of the original kind of designers of it, and to be the program manager of it for several years, where I just ran across the country helping get it set up in different villages. And as a result of that, man, I got to see it at all these different levels. And one of the most fascinating experiences of my life, being involved in that.
I know from my own personal experience, like at the overseas, and then I went over to the schoolhouse afterwards. So my language was Russian, but they had a particular exercise in there to where they showed a video, and they're like, "Hey, who's been deployed? Who's been to a KLE and stuff?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've been." And all right, so has anyone ever seen what a KLE is supposed to look like? And then they have someone in a circle like speaking foreign language, and I don't know if this was right off the cuff. They said it was. Who knows? Probably was, honestly. But you could see the surprise in the faces of the ones there when he's not using his interpreter, and just speaking very fluent back and forth, and that breaking down that first barrier right off of that, and how they use that, but then creating that human connection and stuff. And it's like, oh, that's what a KLE is supposed to look like. Got it. Okay, there's something here, and I knew, I went into Afghanistan. I think I read, and I have it back here on the shelf somewhere, but the field manual for coin that Petraeus had put out. But I knew that in that particular country, that was what we were looking at. That was what we were going to be doing. So it's like, hey, how do I plus myself up on the knowledge to do that? Saw what wrong looked like, and then got to see a little bit of what right looked like. And it was that stark difference. I mean, it was, you guys do a hell of a job on that end.
At times we did, at times we didn't. Honestly, I think there were a lot of times we missed it. We were very infatuated with the surgical strike and all of that as well.
Hey, direct action is sexy.
It is, man. It's more tangible.
Yeah.
And we kind of lost our way on that. And we're still, frankly, in my assessment, we're still a bit of a house divided in the Special Forces Regiment on which way are we going here? Are we by, with, and through? Are we door kickers? And there's still a pull, a tug on that. But the other thing I will tell you, man, and I said this at the convention with the paratroopers, and I'm adamant about it. I don't apologize for it at all. One of the things that I wrote, the reason I wanted to write the book Pineapple Express in third person was because I felt like this was not my memoir at all. Like, this truly was the story of multiple actors who stepped in as protagonists throughout this, almost like a Dunkirk kind of thing, right? And I just happened to be positioned as a good note taker, and so that was how I approached this. But I told the guys in the room at the Airborne Convention, I said, I would love to be able to sit up here and tell you that at the end of the Afghanistan war, there were Green Berets, on the other side of Abbey Gate, pulling in the commandos they had recruited and built over the years. And this is no fault of the Green Beret operators, right? But there wasn't a single Special Forces ODA, on the ground when Afghanistan collapsed. Not one. The last time an ODA had been on the ground as a coherent 12-man team, to the best of my research, and I've looked pretty hard, was somewhere around June, right? Kabul collapsed in August 15th. Or August 15, 2021. Well, Special Forces are supposed to be the nation's premier unconventional warfare asset. Now, if you think about when we went into Afghanistan after 9/11, because the embassy in Afghanistan had been attacked and burned, and we lost our ambassador, we had not been in that country since like 78. So when we went into Afghanistan after 9/11, and we desperately needed to get in there, Fifth Group had no pre-existing relationships with any of the locals. So they brought CIA dudes out of retirement, right, to form these jawbreaker teams to go in there and at least know who dudes were. And one of the things that we looked at each other as a regiment and we said, that can't happen again, right? That can never happen again, because we lost a lot of, and I would even submit that some of the people that we worked with and put into power, had we had a better understanding of local fabric like we were supposed to, right, we probably would not have done that. Now, fast forward to August 15, 2021. Here we are. We've been in there for 20 years. We've built a special operations component that does 95% of the fighting in the country. And it's over 30,000 commandos, Cascatejas, special forces, right? Tier 1 type operators. We left every fucking one of them on the ground with not even a cachet or an unconventional network by which to resist. There was no resistance put in place at all, right? And to me, I get so furious, and I said this, I'm like, what the 82nd Airborne and the Marines did in the final hours at Abbey Gate, pulling our allies through, the reason we're so grateful for it is because those were our friends, and any of us would have been grateful to have been on the ground helping to do that, because many of us are alive because of them. But it was in reality the 82nd Airborne and Marines and other NATO troops that pulled our allies through that were able to get through. And if it was SF guys, they were their individual augmentees or staff guys. So, I tell you all that because, like, yeah, we got some stuff right on VSO, but as a community, we got a lot wrong at the end, and we need to learn from it. And we still, to this day, in my assessment, have not done an institutional after-action review that I would feel comfortable that this wouldn't happen to my son 10 years from now.
I talked with somebody who was involved with Digital Dunkirk. I know he's actually another Casemate author, Michael Cook, with, you might actually have talked to him before. I think he had said you guys crossed paths somewhere in there. Yeah, Life and Death at Abbey Gate, talking about some of the things that people went through in there. And it was just, man, like, so let me back up really quick, because I know I have a lot of friends and stuff of mine that are jaded about what happened there, like the pullout and everything like that. But before that, let's go back to, you find yourself, you turn down a command or something like that.
I retired, basically.
Yeah, and you left. You're just, it sounds disgruntled, and sort of searching. You had lost that purpose and stuff, but you found yourself in a closet.
Yeah, it got pretty dark. It got real dark for me. I mean, it started looking around the country at the level of division in the country, kind of like Younger says, the level of contempt everywhere I looked. And I was like, man, what's the point? Like, what we did all this over there so we could, tear each other apart here at home. And I think it fueled what was already a level of moral injury from how we had really abandoned our village stability partners. I felt very responsible for that. I didn't have any answers for it. A lot of what I had believed in terms of by, with, and through had been violated, frankly. And, I wasn't really leveling blame on anybody but myself. I just felt like I'm the one that made a promise to these people and I broke it, like I wasn't able to keep it, and now they're dead. And and that really affected me. And it opened up, I think, Will, the corridor for all the other stuff that I had just buried over the years to just come screaming in. I wasn't talking to anybody. I was already pretty isolated. I was very, very susceptible to what came with that. And, I lost my way, man. I got really, really isolated. I got really, really depressed, and started thinking that my wife and my kids would be better off without me, that I was not just a burden, but that I was irrelevant. And for me, that was the worst feeling in the world, when I started to realize that I'm not relevant anymore. And I'm like 42, at the time. And so I ended up several times actually standing in a closet. One time, I came as close as you can get, man. Like, I danced with that devil as close as you can get. And to this day, I'm just glad I'm standing here, because I was at a point in my head where, I just didn't care, and I just wanted it to stop. And it's almost like looking outside my body now when I look back at it. But it was a very, very dark place, and for the grace of God, I didn't. And I did emerge from that point in my life, and some mentors came to my aid that I never expected. They were civilians. They weren't even veterans. And who, they turned me on to the modality of storytelling as a way to heal, just as a way to heal. It wasn't with anything else, no expectations. And I started working through my backstory with a really competent storyteller coach, and he helped me make sense of it, and start to make sense of it through a timeless aspect that, frankly, we've been doing since like Odysseus. And as that started to happen, I started to get more of a sense of myself, and I started to kind of come back into the world, and it's kind of been a sprint ever since.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, going from that low point where you didn't see the way forward to where it was, thinking about pulling the trigger, sticking a gun in your mouth and saying, hey, you know what, this is it. Thank goodness, that you didn't, and that you're here, because this stuff, that the ripple effect of the people that you've affected through the things you've done, that right there says something that someone out there might think, what do I have to offer? And this is why am I struggling? And to be able to pick yourself up, but then now what you're doing with everything, I mean, multiple, you have a lot of different things, and it seems like your purpose out there, you are connecting with others, and you really have that leadership and that human connection at the forefront, but going from the complete reverse of that, and then turning that process around and saying, you know what, I am here for a reason, and that is, and I didn't know, I actually thought the book Pineapple Express came before Last Out. I did not know the order was the other way around.
I tell people when they watch the play or they watch it on Amazon Prime, you're going to think we wrote this after the collapse. And we didn't. I knew, in my heart what was coming, because I had seen a microcosm of it with VSO.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so if you look deeply at the storyline, it looks like the abandonment of Afghanistan, but what it really was the abandonment of the villages in 2012. But to the audience, it reads, it's the same story. What's personal is universal, like Dr. Carl Rogers says, right? And so it has a universality to it. But talking about the coming, being in that closet and really just feeling completely irrelevant and isolated, there was a point where, as I started to kind of emerge back into the world a little bit and working on my storytelling, the one thing that kept nagging me was that just all the division in the country and the isolation that a lot of our veterans were going through, but also just like the in groups and out groups in the country that are just tearing each other apart. And I thought, man, like, I've been around that my whole life. I actually built methodologies on how to restore trust and bridge gaps and use narrative and active listening and old school interpersonal skills as a way to go in a room and turn that room in a way that there's actually social capital over time. And I thought, if I could only, I want to teach that. I could bring that here, I taught it in the schoolhouse. Like, it's a thing. I even call it the Lawrenceian skill set, after Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
And storytelling became the platform or the strategic vehicle by which I could do that. I started to kind of stop pulling back, and storytelling gave me the ability to get up on a stage with a bunch of, I don't know, veterans that were going through it, or commercial bankers or whoever, and tell the stories of what I had experienced or seen over there. And then it would help people make sense of what their own lived experience was, just like the saber-toothed tiger. And then see new patterns. Their brain could see new patterns for a way forward instead of the old neural story map that was jacking them up. And that for me that's when I knew, like, okay, like this is the path. And then as far as the tempo, man, I know people say to me all the time, like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you are literally going to run. But honestly, Will, like, and I don't know how you feel about this, man, but as I get older and I think about those buddies that didn't get back, and I think about their kids and their wives, like, dude, I have to do this. Like, this is the rate I have to run, man, because I have the chance to do that. And to not do that is, to me, is dishonoring them, man. Like, I've got to run at this rate because I get a chance to, and I get a chance. to run it for them too, you know?
I think that's a lot of us should be realigned on that end of things. And it is, I tell other people that, that's why with stuff, I go back and remember that, like, hey, what are you doing this for? Some of those guys aren't coming back. You know, so you have almost a charge to live doubly in a way.
100%.
And that's kind of how I feel about it. But once you start giving back into that, and once you start reconnecting with others and start seeing things click with them, or the lights come on and they get it, and then they start, and they're bringing someone else into the fold, and then they're reconnecting with some of their old support system because they're starting to realize how far away from the flagpole they've gotten. That right there, when you start reinvigorating that purpose, it's almost like a drive behind it that can sustain that sort of pace to where people, because I really do, I think a lot of people kind of float through life. There's a lot that they're just there. They don't see the writing, or, they let things get them down. When it's not, why is this happening to me right now? But it's, what is life trying to teach me? What should I be learning right now? What should I be looking for?
Yeah. You ever heard of Stephen Pressfield?
It sounds familiar, but I'm not
you
placing
might
it.
know some of his work. So he's an author, and one of my favorites, actually. He does both fiction and nonfiction. He wrote Gates of Fire, the story about the Spartans. He wrote the Legend of Bagger Vance as a screenplay, and then The War of Art, Turning Pro, self-help books. He's a former Marine, but old Steve, he's in his 70s now. He if you ever get a chance to check out War of Art, I would strongly recommend it. Like, he talks about how resistance shows up in our life, and most of his life as a writer, he'll tell you, was not success. He failed, he procrastinated, he over medicated, and finally hit whatever you call success, and lives up in the hills of California, living a pretty good life, doesn't mostly just writes. But you know what? He and his significant other Diana, they lost their home in those fires, and I mean, they lost everything. Like, they lost every single thing, and they are rebuilding from the ground up. And I don't know all the reasons for it, but it's really put them in a bad way. Like, they are having to. I mean, it's not good. But you know what he does is he always had this blog called Writing Wednesdays, and now, as they're up on that mountainside every day trying to figure out how the Corps of Engineers is going to get these trucks up there to move stuff off their home, and he writes about it. He writes about it as he goes through it, and he just says, I have an obligation to share with you guys what I'm going through, what we're learning, and because this is the grist for the mill right here, And I thought, man, to have the presence of mind to do that. And to be able to do that, I just loved it. And I just think because I talk to guys sometimes, and they'll tell me, like, buddies that are veterans, they're like, man, I've done so much. I've really effed up. I've lost my family. I've been using, and I'm like, brother, that's just grist for the mill, man. Like, that's the rocket fuel for actually getting back in the game and having an impact. Like, because how many other people do you think are in that spot, veteran or not? And I call it the generosity of scars, man, like the repurposing of your struggle in the service of others through the stories you tell. It's just more ammunition for the fight, honestly. And I know that sounds cliche, but I really believe that.
No, it's, there's the bookshelf back here is full, and I have boxes and boxes and boxes of other books and stuff, but why would you not have, like, or go through that information that someone else has lived through already, that a lot of times by the time it gets into a book, as long as it's unfiltered, or they are at least able to put it in there, why not learn those frameworks instead of having to go through it yourself? It blows my mind. Pick up a book. There's nothing new under the sun.
No,
there really isn't. It blows my mind sometimes with that, those things said. But then at the same time, you go and look at one of the small villages we were outside of, Piri Pamal. You can actually go in Google and look up Piri Pamal, and boom, there's things from the Russians in there, experiencing some of the same stuff that we did, and then the Brits back in the late 1800s, talking about this particular village being like a stronghold that they couldn't get into because of X, Y, and Z. And you're like, oh my God, and it just goes back. There was one of them that there was I think it was Charlie Company that had it to where you would crest over this hill and there was ruins from Alexander's day, and that nothing is new under the sun. This has been lived before. And that being said too, is storytelling and having to do with that. I really do. Have you looked too much or a bunch into the Native American traditions of storytelling once like the war party and stuff got back?
Not a little. I've done some. I've done some work with Canadian indigenous communities. I worked with several over in Afghanistan on storytelling, and a lot of work in Appalachia, and I've done some work with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And I've got a few books on what you're talking about. Yeah, it's again, it's not, there's so much there. There's so much wisdom there. A lot of them would call them their knowledge keepers or their wisdom keepers. And they were the storytellers, they were the storytellers. And the thing that I tell people all the time too, is because the world that we live in today has become so modern and transactional and so information based, IT based, that we've dismissed storytelling as an asset. And I think I'm talking about oral storytelling.
Yeah.
Any kind of storytelling is powerful, but oral storytelling, I think, is the most underused leadership asset at our disposal. And we're just leaving tons of social capital on the table in every imaginable way.
That was one of the biggest gripes in the soft schoolhouse at the time. And they would actually send the kids out at the end of the day and be like, hey, go to the car dealerships, go to the restaurants, go talk with people, because that's the problem with your generation is you guys don't talk to anybody anymore because you do it all through either a phone or a different social medium.
It's true, man. I call it narrative competence, the ability to employ metaphor, framing, and purposeful storytelling in real time to meet your goals. Right. And it's a real competency. Like, I mean, the use of narrative, it's one thing to speak it from the stage, a TED talk or a keynote, but I'm talking about in real time, when, your employee has made a mistake at work and you're able to bring a story forward of when you screwed up. Same in the military, or your kid's dealing with addiction, and to be able to, I mean, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Alcoholics Anonymous is brilliant at it. We talk about indigenous communities. Alcoholics Anonymous are some of the best storytellers on the planet. And as a result of that, they've helped millions of people get sober. And what do? They use oral storytelling. That's all they do. I mean, that's all it is. And it started with two drunks in Akron, Ohio, 1915. It couldn't get sober in any institution. And they said, let's have a meeting, And so like even what you and I are doing right here, and you look at the podcasting and what an amazing medium it is for change. But in reality, even that's not new, man. Dr. Bob and Bill W. were doing that back in Akron way back before there was anything like this. And look what it led to,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty bullish, honestly, on the storytelling, the human connection. I'm pretty bullish on our generation of warfighters and their families. I just think we've just got to be at their shoulder and help them in different ways get back in the game the way they want to and the way they're most relevant. But that's what I'm gonna spend my days doing, man. I'm telling you, like, that's all I care about.
Making those connections, it's key. It really is. And when you bring other people in like that, they're relating through that story. So I mean, that vulnerability in sharing, I know is one of the biggest things to where you get in your head a lot of times. I'm sure you have, like, I don't think I should share that. That might be a little too intimate in the details end, but it's those things that you do share like that in a way that other person sees it and they see it's real. They see it's genuine. They see that you're being vulnerable and honest with them. And more times than not, it builds that bridge.
This is something I talk a lot about in our veteran storytelling workshops. And in fact, on my online community platform at the Scott Mann Leadership Academy, this came up last night. Someone was saying that they were, just the aspect of of talking about some of the things that they've been through, it feels like very exposed, you know. And the reality is, when you people listen to a story, right? So if you talk about like what you went through coming home from service, as an example, and maybe it was traumatic, maybe it wasn't, but there was most definitely struggles that you went through and ways that you overcame them and things that you learned. And people listen to that, they're listening autobiographically. They're actually locating themselves in your story so that it's a survival mechanism, just like the saber-toothed tiger, right? And so there's autobiographical listening happening. And sometimes I think the vulnerability thing, the way Brene Brown has presented it, and she's really brilliant, I think in some ways maybe it kind of can scare certain folks off because, like, we're trained, don't be vulnerable, don't stick your jugular out, that'll get you killed. And what I tell folks is, look, humans are social creatures. We're supposed to be social. And so storytelling is a social modality for accelerated learning and wisdom. So when you're talking about pivotal moments and struggles and traumas, maybe instead of saying I'm going to be vulnerable, just ask yourself, how do I be relatable right now? Right?
Yeah.
How can I be relatable in this moment? And what I found is, if you're really focused on being relatable to the other party as you tell that story in their service, you'll be just vulnerable enough that's appropriate for that moment. It'll just happen. Rather than being vulnerable as an intention, be relatable as an intention and let the vulnerability just come alongside. And it will.
No, that's solid right there. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really good advice.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I think, and I have to do that too, because I find myself, no. But then I think, all right, well, who am I telling this story? I'm telling this for them. This isn't for me. This is like, this is what can, I got scuffed up. So maybe we can learn something from this. And when you just focus on relating to them and what they need, they just flips the whole thing.
So that your book goes into some of that on the newest one, and talking about cutting through the churn is what you put it as. And I keep coming across that term in there, and I'm like, man, there's the churn again. Like, what does he mean by the, so matter of fact, I'm actually just going to ask you direct. I have my own ideas of what the churn is, and I don't know if that was intentional in your writing. Like, okay, like let the reader kind of decide. But what is the churn in that book?
Well, I mean, I define the churn as just a novel, unprecedented set of social conditions that basically gets in the way of us connecting with other humans, right? So it's the enemy is not the Democrat or Republican across from you, although we act that way. The enemy is actually the churn. So the enemy, just the same way that if I go into a village, it's really easy to think that, especially after we just came out of an IED, that elder that's sitting next to that AK-47 kind of looking smugly at me is the enemy. But he's probably not, right? There's a set of social conditions that have to be dealt with here. There's 40 years of pre-existing microhistory, grievances, like that's got to be dealt with. And I think that's the case here in our country today. And so the churn, I kind of give it three macro subdivisions. It's the arena that we live in. It's the environment, right? It's volatile, VUCA, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Then it's the human terrain or the human operating system of the, I call it the 4Ds. We're overly distracted, disengaged, disconnected, and divided, right? And so each of those in the human terrain is really new. Like, we have not been as distracted in the last 5 years as we are right now. We have not been as divided in the last 5 years as we are right now. So it's novel. And then the final one is actually internal, and that's what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance. I think we're dealing with higher levels of resistance, self-sabotage, imposter syndrome as a result of all the social media and the pressing on us internally. We're more inclined to pull ourselves back from those moments. So there's both external and internal pressure that I call this churn and learning. So in other words, I could be the best in the world at negotiating the human across from me. But if I don't have that inwardly sound ability to quiet my own resistance and do diaphragmatic breathing to bring myself down to a parasympathetic state, then I'm just going to, it's what I do with that negotiation is not going to matter, because my own resistance is what's going to take me out, and put me into that trance-like state. So the churn, and I do leave some room there for the reader to really contextually form it in their own mind. The big thing I just want to get across is it's probably not the dude or dudette across from you that's the enemy. That, as Sebastian Junger says, when we treat our neighbor with the same contempt that we treat an enemy, we are not long of this earth, and that's what we're doing. And so I'm just trying to redirect it metaphorically into the conditions that surround us. So let's figure out how to navigate that and connect with the human across from us instead of trying to take them out.
How many times have you sat across from somebody who you thought you had a disagreement with and then realized that the both of you were really had the same end goal in mind? You were just saying it in a different way.
Exactly. Have you ever heard the old saying, it's hard to hate the storyteller?
No, I haven't.
If you stop and think about it, if you honestly ask someone a how or what question about their backstory and you listen with full intention to see the pictures in their head, it's almost impossible to hate them when they tell their story.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're open about it.
Yeah. I mean, at the end, Adam, you may not agree with them, but you now have a level of shared perspective.
Yep.
Of why they do what they do, where it comes from in their life, and there's a narrative. It's made sense of what their actions are. And you may not agree with it, but now we have a shared perspective and there's a bond. And that's why I say, like, it doesn't matter what the culture is, the language, the race, the ethnicity. This is primal 250,000-year-old stuff. Like, if we just tap into meaning and emotion and social connection and storytelling and struggle, those alone can be wonderful assets for us to navigate the churn. And you don't do it anymore.
Much stronger together as a group too. I mean, that is, oh my gosh, when you try to do something on your own, but then like, hey, this person knows this or this and that, and you start reaching out and creating those networks and someone that you could reach out to, or they reach out to you about something, and you start realizing that you can plus each other up, and oh man, I guess just get there so much quicker.
People ask me what the biggest takeaway I had from Pineapple Express, and you know what it was? It was that, the power of relationships in a crisis. I mean, basically, I came right in this room, just right behind me when we started working to get Nizam out, and I was calling buddies, Will, I hadn't talked to in 10 years, and that, what they said? It wasn't like, okay, Scott, let me get back to you. And I got my wife and kids right now. And every single one of them said, Nizam, are we putting the band back together? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Kinda, maybe. And they're like, I'm in, man. Well, tell me what we're doing. What do you need? Every one of them, even a battalion commander, 1st to the 10th in Stuttgart, Germany. Hey, let me clear my calendar for the next 72 hours. Tell me what you need. And he ended up being the guy that walked Nizam in and guided him in, because he was his team leader, and he knew that. He knew that was the role he had to play. So he's like, I'm clearing the deck for a sec. Now, if I had called him cold, and said, I don't think that would have been the case, but there was such a pre-existing amount of social capital. And that's what I think we're just forgetting in today's society, is like, it doesn't matter what the crisis is. You're not getting through that shit alone. You're going to get through it based on the relationship portfolio that you built when risk was low.
Yep. Well, didn't you just do something with your community more recently with one of the hurricanes?
We did. Yeah. I mean, we've actually leveraged Pineapple for the fires in West Maui. There were other volunteer groups that did much more in Western North Carolina than we did, but we delivered Narcan into unreachable areas. We delivered trauma intervention teams to ministers and first responders in places where they hadn't even seen the National Guard in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And it was all the Pineapple Network that did that. And again, that's not unique to Pineapple. That's just what I'm trying to make the point here, is that the relationships you build when risk is low are what you're going to count on when the stakes go high. Yeah. And we've forgotten that in this modern world.
Well, that and the ability, like, people just, that binding together when that flag goes up and says, or the star cluster goes up, and they're like, hey man, like, this now needed, like, and just how many people jump out there. My old sergeant major was I saw pictures and stuff, but they were riding in the Asheville area on horseback.
Insane. Yeah, and flying
Crazy.
helicopters. They were clearing LZs and doing Pathfinder shit. I mean,
Yep.
but and of course we're sitting there going, yeah, look at that. That's what you know because that's what we did for 20 years. That goes back to our original conversation is the men and women who would get handed that shit sandwich and they would just do it. They would figure it out. And we as a community, we got so fast and so efficient and so agile at doing that
Yeah.
that we don't even realize that it's a collective superpower in our community. We look at each other and go, "Oh, doesn't everybody do a pack train into Western North Carolina when there's no way to get to people? Isn't that what you do?" Am I? But the reality is, it's a very special thing, and that could be applied to a range of problems that we're facing when institutions fail. Um, and I think there's really something to that. And that's where I say, like, the rest of the country can kind of step back and go, "Oh, wow, like, how did they do that?" Well, they did that because they have better relationships and deeper relationships, and they trust each other, and they're fast
Oh,
because they move at the speed of trust, as Covey says. And, you know, it was okay. It was a hurricane in Western North Carolina. It could be a terror attack in 4 cities, 2 years from now. You'll see GWAT guys do the same thing.
yeah. Oh, and that was my surprise too, though, is seeing, where they're beating out, the relief efforts of government like far, far in front of. I mean, in certain places it didn't even show up, and here these guys are. Crazy.
Yep, it's crazy, man. But I do think that it's really something we should take stock of. It's something our government should take stock of. Is that actually there's kind of an X factor in this country right now
Yeah.
with these GWAT veterans because they're young enough that, and they're in all these different places. They're young enough that they can still do amazing things, and
Sure.
we need them because our institutions. I hate to say it, but they're failing. Our institutions are failing us in a range of ways. And it may just be that at this point in history, we have to rely more on bottom up grassroots organizations to do heavy lifting. And I guess I'm okay with that. I feel like, again, I look at like what you're doing and a lot of the veterans out there that are stepping into the breach. And I'm like, I think I'd rather see them do it, honestly. But I would like to see the government maybe acknowledge that and
Yeah.
go, okay, maybe we need to relook the whole soldier for life, Marine Corps for life, private public relationship and really, really acknowledge it and make it a thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the answers, but I just know that every time there's a thorny problem nationally or internationally, you see a bunch of GWAT dudes jumping into the fray, solving it.
Yep. Yeah. If anything, we're just like those frustrated guys that are, you know what? That's all right. Fine. Let me get in there and make this happen.
It's crazy. And again, they're so networked. That's the thing that I think such an anomaly is that they're using the timeless age-old veteran relationship, but they've also got a dynamic capacity to use these things in real time.
Yeah.
And they're networked, and the network has been there. We've been doing some version of this since 9/11, and we don't even know how fast we are.
Yeah.
And, if you look at what we did around, I mean, I talked to a minister. I went on the ground in Western North Carolina talking to a minister of two congregations of what the veterans were doing versus FEMA, and she started laughing. She was like, "It's not even." She was like, "It's not even. It's not even close."
Yeah. Yeah. I would think I mean, really in that motivation alone, like I've just seen like aid workers compared to, veterans or somebody who's active and see just the difference in their in drive and motivation. Don't get me wrong. I'm not taking a crap on organizations and stuff out there. There are some really great people, but there is a difference. There's definitely a difference.
For sure.
We've been on a whole bunch of time, and before we end or before we go, I definitely want to go through some of this stuff that to put in the description line. But here I am talking to an author, yet we haven't really talked about how to get your own story down. So just really, I guess, an abbreviated version of that. Like, Scott, how can someone else start putting their own story down, or where does somebody start?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I believe you start with the pivotal moment that kind of comes up, kind of bubbles up. That most of us, we live moment to moment. We live in moments, you know, and a lot of times I found that the stories that have the most impact are those moments that are kind of welling up within us. And we, you know, it's either a struggle or a pivotal moment where you were going along this way and all of a sudden life took you this way. You know, I believe we're gifted those moments from another place. I think those are gifted to us. And, you know, when you become aware of those, sit down and honor the muse and start moving the pen and write about that pivotal moment. Start with that. Start about in what it felt like, tasted like, smelled like. Start with the moment itself, and then how you responded to it, what it, you know, and then what happened and what the struggle was and what did you learn or how did you change as a result of that. That alone, that is the basic framework of the hero's journey. You know, did a guide show up and assist you in that? And a lot of times, if you think about like even Black Hawk Down, that started with a moment. We have a Black Hawk Down, you know, like, and then it built out from there. I just think that because that's how we are the protagonist in our own story. That's how the brain navigates the world. It's a metaphorical pattern matching organ. So it's constantly telling itself a story with you as the protagonist in the moments that you live in. So those moments, they bubble back up and you know what they are. I mean, like if you're really just still after a workout or you feel them, honor that. Sit down and just move the pen. Don't worry so much about framework or where you're going to publish, but honor the moment. Write about the moment, and what's personal is universal. If it matters to you, if you felt it a certain way, we'll feel it. And you know, take that sucker all the way through the struggle outside the moment, what you learned and how you changed. And that alone, I think, can make, at a minimum, a beautiful talk or oral story that might change or even save someone's life. And who knows, maybe a book or a memoir.
Right. So Rooftop Leadership Academy, you have that going on, right?
It's Scott Mann Leadership Academy. And the methodology I use is called Rooftop Leadership, how we in VSO got guys to go up on their rooftops and fight through old school interpersonal skills. But the Academy, Will, is on School, SKOOL. And it's free to join, but it's just anybody who's passionate about human connection, storytelling, active listening. We've got tons of content in there. Some of it's paid, some of it's free. We do live calls, great peer-to-peer interaction from multiple walks of life. We just started it. We just launched it, and I'm really proud of it. I think people would really enjoy it.
I need to tune into one of those.
I'll send you the link.
Okay, yeah, please do. And I'll put it in the description for the people that are listening as well. You know, I mean, just because like if we start going through all this, because you have the Academy, you have the two different books that are out. You're running the Scott Mann podcast, which, by the way, phenomenal. Love the content that you've put out so far.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's awesome. You know, it's really cool to see. I've gone back and listened to some of your older stuff, and then to see the new iteration, and then the next iteration and stuff, and it's been that plus up along the way. It's been so cool to watch and see the difference and see you along the way too, kind of evolve.
I've evolved a lot. Yeah, I've changed a lot, and it's been a cool experience. And I'm sure you're the same way. And it's just different forms of storytelling that I'm immersing myself in. That's all it is. I'm just telling the stories in different forms and kind of reporting as I go and trying to do it in the most impactful way. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. Most of my stuff, I think all of it's on scottmann.com. And then I'll send you the link to the school platform.
Yeah. So that's our link tree is scottmann.com. And again, just look in the description for anybody who's listening, and I'll take care of putting all that stuff in there too. Scott,
Awesome.
Hang tight really quick. I want to talk to you after about a few things, but thanks for coming on the show and sharing. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. My honor, brother. Take care.
You too. Thanks for joining us on another veteran success story. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, go and tell somebody else. The content that I put in here, I try to make it something that it's something to help other people out there. I know it's already affected myself in a few different ways, in the way that I'm putting forward some of my efforts and thinking in this show and in helping others out there. So I know that it's going to be helpful to others out there. So if it helped you out, or if the subject interested you at all, tell somebody else. That's all I ask. Actually, I take that back. That's not all I ask. I ask one more thing. Follow and subscribe, because it doesn't cost you anything. 97% of the people out there that listen to the show, they keep coming back, but they're not subscribing. That's how I can actually provide this sort of thing, or keep this show going in a way to where I'm not going to have to put ads into it. I don't want to do that. I didn't enjoy it when I don't enjoy it when shows do that, and I won't do that to you, or at least hopefully not. But with more subscribers, more followers, I'm able to reach more people. And I'm not going to, this platform is really being built in a way to amplify others' voices. This is not about me. This is not really about my story. This is about others and amplifying their message out there in ways that really I've found personally helpful. So go to scottmann.com for more. Check out his book, Operation Pineapple Express, which everyone knows. I think he was featured recently on the Jack Carr episode. So if you don't know much about that book, you can go over there. Multiple other podcasts out there. His newest book, Nobody is Coming to Save You. Another great one that's out there. You can find it almost anywhere. I think he even has it in Walmart now. So scottmann.com, look into his Leadership Academy, Rooftop Leadership. And I'll put all this stuff in the description links. If you guys like the show, again, tell someone else, subscribe, all that good stuff. But tune in next week. I have somebody else coming on the show to where I think you guys are really going to enjoy this next episode. Check it out, and I'll see you next week. This has been yet another veteran success story.